All right. Welcome, everyone, to our latest virtual author visit here at the Lincoln Public Library. We're going to give everyone a minute to get moved in from the waiting room, make sure everybody has a chance to log in because we are just at 6 o'clock. But thank you, everyone who's joining us. I'm very excited for our visit today. All right. So thank you again. So yes, just for those Battle of the Books participants, if you are in a team, feel free to drop that team name in the chat. And then over the course of the program, if you have questions for Terry, our author, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A. And if you wouldn't mind just dropping your team name in parentheses at the end of that so we can keep track of all those questions. You can drop those in at any time. If you came with questions prepared, you can drop them in now. That will make sure that we leave enough time in our program for all of the questions. Or if you think of things over the course of the next about 40 minutes, feel free to drop them in as you think of them, and we will do those questions at the end. And again, for everyone, whether you're in Battle of the Books or not, for everyone who's joining us for our author visit, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. If you don't know me, my name is Kathryn Hunt. I'm the director of the Lincoln Public Library. And a little bit of housekeeping for how our virtual author visits work. In just a moment, I'm going to introduce our fantastic author. We're going to have a chat for a few minutes about his work and his process as an author. And then at the end, we will have some time for audience questions. So please feel free to drop any of those questions in the Q&A. We also have, courtesy of our friends of the Lincoln Public Library, some giveaways that we will give out randomly to attendees of our event tonight. Those include a copy of both Blood Debts and the sequel, Blood Justice by Terry J. Benton-Walker, our author tonight, as well as separately a gift card to Amazon to pick up a book of your choice. Though, of course, we would recommend our author's book. So those we will pull at the end of the night, and we will reach out to you after the event via the email you registered with if you are one of our winners. But thank you to our friends of the Lincoln Public Library for supporting programs like these, not just with fun giveaways, but with support all throughout the year. I see we have a question in the chat. Please feel free to put those questions in the Q&A. Fantastic. All right, so all of that out of the way, again, my name is Kathryn Hunt, and I am delighted to welcome all of you to our virtual author visit with Terry J. Benton-Walker. He is the author not only of our Battle of the Book selection, Blood Debts, which is the beginning of a fantastic young adult contemporary fantasy series. He is also the author of middle grade contemporary fantasy series, Alex Wise, as well as an editor for The White Guy Dies First, a young adult horror anthology featuring 12 subversive stories by authors of color. And so, Terry, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're so excited to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. This is fun.
Fantastic. And so I was wondering, just to get started, easiest question first always, if you could share with us a little bit about you and your journey on becoming an author.
Mhm. Yes, it was a very interesting path to me becoming an author because I that wasn't my original path. So I graduated from Georgia Tech. I'm an industrial engineer, and I also went to Georgia State and I got my MBA. And I worked in manufacturing and operations for about 17 years before I decided to stop doing that and write full time. But over that whole 17-year process, I decided that I wanted to start writing books seriously. And it started because I was going through a very serious time in my life. And I was just doing a lot of reflecting and contemplating, and I was free writing. And it just turned into a story and it turned into a chapter. And so I posted it on Facebook to just see if like anybody would like it or if the story might have legs. And people read it and they were like, oh, this is interesting. Like, what's going to happen next? And so, I kept going and I wrote another chapter and I posted it and more people read it. And so each time I would do it, like more people would get interested and then more people would want to know like what was happening next. And so I said, okay, I'm going to turn it into an entire book. And it took me 2 years to write that book. I took about 6 months off in between because I needed a break. And I queried, I want to say maybe 170 different agents, and I got rejected by every single one of them. And but I did not give up because I knew that that was something that I wanted to do because it was something very different from my original career, like writing a book and going through that process. Even though I kind of failed at that beginning stage, I knew that I was on the right path, and so I kept going. And it would take me 8 years and seven different manuscripts before I signed with my agent in the fall of 2019. And then in the summer of 2020, we sold Blood Debts to Tor Team at Macmillan. And that was my debut novel series, my debut series, which is why we're here today.
So that is a story of perseverance. I know, I forget where I read it, but I remember one author talking about pinning up all of the rejection notices as evidence of trying, right? That you were out
Hmm.
there, that you were doing the legwork to get there.
Hmm.
Do you have like a folder of all of those, or did you just let those go and delete them?
No, I was at one point keeping a folder, but like I reached a point where like I didn't need to like go back to witness that anymore. Like it was kind of ingrained in me, like the struggle. And plus like I talk about it a lot of the times too, because like I have four mentees and I try to be cognizant of the people who are coming up behind me in the industry. And so like I always share my story and try to be uplifting to other people. So I remember it that way instead of going back and like physically reading all of the hurt.
Absolutely, absolutely. Have any of those like previous early manuscripts, have they like found pieces of them ways into your current work, or were they just stories you had to work through to get to Blood Debts in your work since then?
Oh no. So funny story. Blood Debts, both Blood Debts and Alex Wise were books that I queried that like got rejected, that no agent wanted. The book that my agent signed me for has not been published yet. So that is actually my next like big project. It's a book for adults, and we'll talk about it later. But but yeah, so when my agent and I had the initial conversation, she told me that she wanted to sign me because she really liked that book. She asked what else I had in the pipeline. And I told her about Blood Debts. And at the time, it wasn't called Blood Debts, it was called Queen. And she was interested and she read it and she asked me what I thought about it. And I was like, well, I can't stop thinking about this book. And I was like, I just feel like I have to do it first because I can't let it go. And she said, okay, but she's like, it needs a lot of work. So are you ready? And I was like, absolutely. And so over the next like year, we worked on like completely rewriting it and getting it ready for a submission. And that was when I truly like when Blood Debts came out. And so I actually have her to credit for the title because I wanted to keep it titled Queen, but she was like, "What about Blood Debts?" And I was like, "Oh, I like that."
That's fantastic. And so I guess with that, just kind of a question about process, but with that, like, so with Blood Debts or with your other books, what kind of comes first? Do you character, setting, plot, like conflict?
Mhm.
Or are you more of, we always talk with NaNoWriMo, like the plotter versus pantser question. Is it just the
Mhm.
story as it comes out? Kind of, how do you come to your stories?
Oh, I am super analytical and logical. Like that's my engineering background. So before I sit down to draft a single thing, I have to know every single detail about the story. And so it typically starts with like the seed of an idea and it's a concept or like I might hear something interesting when I'm watching television. I'm like, I wonder like what would happen if like this really happened in that scenario instead of that. Very rarely do I start with a character. I typically start with a concept and then like the character sort of stems from there. And I have like a whole process that I've actually recorded in a novel planning kit, which is a kit that I developed. It's a series of worksheet exercises that I developed to help authors create their or develop their stories from concept to a detailed outline, which is the same process that I use. And so I created it because it took me 8 years and seven manuscripts to sign with my agent. And part of the reason why it took so long was because I didn't have access to information. So every time I would put a manuscript out there and it would get rejected, I would take some time to study craft. I would buy a new craft book and I would read it and take what I needed and take what could help me like learn and level up my craft and like toss away the rest and start fresh on a new project. And I would do it every time. And so I found some things worked better for me than others. And so what I did was I took all of the best exercises for building a novel concept and I put it in these series of worksheets and I put it up on my website and it's available for free download. And I put that out there as a resource to help other emerging authors, especially authors of color like myself, who might not have access to the same amount of resources and everything that everyone else has. So, and that really like details my process from concept to outline. And like I still use it for every single project. Like I go and I download it myself and like I'll print out certain worksheet pages to reuse.
That's really fantastic. And that's really fantastic that you put that into a form that you can share with others in the writing community. Um, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of like your experience with the writing community. Has that been a big support for you through your process, or, can a little bit of what that's like?
Hmm. Absolutely. I have found some of my best friends in the writing community. Adam Sass, who is the author of the most recent Cursed Boys and Broken Hearts, and also Your Lonely Nights Are Over. He is my best friend, and I actually met him when he was going on submission for his debut young adult novel, Surrender Your Sons, which is an absolutely amazing young adult thriller. And so, like, and I have a lot of other friends too and like the community has been really great to me, which is good because community is also something that's really important for me. Like one of my life goals is to leave the world and the communities that I interact with better than I found them. So it's really important for me to make sure that like I'm giving more than I'm taking from the community and I'm also like supporting those around me and like the whole ecosystem, including the authors that are coming up from behind me, as well as those who are like standing right next to me, and those who paved the way before me too.
That's great to hear because I think sometimes we think of writing, and there is something to be said in the act of writing
Hmm.
is really between you and a page and solitary, but it does take
Hmm.
place in such a community. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
that's wonderful to see that. So, talking about Blood Debts, I was wondering whether you could provide for us, for anyone who hasn't read it, just kind of a brief little summary of
Hmm.
Blood Debts before we get into some questions about it.
Yes. So 30 years after the most brutal magical massacre in New Orleans history, twin heirs of a dethroned family set out to right the wrongs in their family's past and bring about the justice that they are owed. I like to pitch this series as a contemporary Game of Thrones featuring Black and Black queer teens set in a modern day New Orleans. And if you are a fan of television shows like Game of Thrones or the originals or Vampire Diaries, and you just wish that it were more diverse and more queer, then this is the series for you. And the sequel is called Blood Justice. And we don't have news on more books yet, but I envision this series to be 5 books. And so we have some things in the works. So hopefully we will have news soon. But
Fantastic. And then this is one of our questions from our audience members, but if you could share a little bit about how you first came up with the idea for it.
mhm. Yes. Actually, the very first idea for Blood Debts, it wasn't a book. It was a television series, and it was not featuring Chris and Clem. It was featuring their mother and her sisters, and it was about the magic system was just voodoo. It was a lot simpler. It was much simpler times back then. It was just voodoo, and they were like the family was split, and a lot of the conflict was within their family and in their sisterhood because they were all like vying for control of the voodoo throne. And as I started like planning the characters and like setting up the world and the story and everything, I was like, this is so much more than I can just put into a screenplay. I was like, I need to write an entire novel. And I was like, I can adapt it later. That'll be easier. But I was like, I need to like think through so much and I don't want to leave anything out. So I was like, I have to write a novel first. And so I started, and then when I started thinking about it in novel format, I knew that I wanted to write young adult. And I knew that if I wrote it as young adult, I would need to focus on some young Chris and Clem first came onto the scene. From the very first draft of the book, they were always part of the story. They weren't as central in the first part, in the very first draft of that book. There were a lot of chapters from the adults. Like I had perspectives from Ursula and Rosalie and even characters that got cut all together from the final manuscript. So it's changed a lot, but Chris and Clem have always been there from the very beginning.
Fantastic. That's really interesting with the transition from conceiving it as kind of a TV series to conceiving it as a novel. And then that kind of came from the story that you wanted to tell. Um, One of the other questions that we have from the audience about blood debts, which is an interesting one with that, talking about how it's changed and transformed, which is there
Mhm.
anything that you would change about the book now?
Um, that's a very good question. Well, not specifically blood debts, but blood justice. This is this is something that bothers me. it is a typo they got through. So if you are paying attention in, I believe it's part three or part four, where Chris and Clem are talking to a character that you meet later on in the story named Emma. And Emma prefers tea over coffee. And like it's a whole thing in the scene. And Clem and Chris go get her tea and they bring it back. And so I'm referencing like Emma taking a drink and I say Emma takes a sip of her coffee. And someone pointed that out to me, and now I cannot unsee it. Like it haunts me. Like, like I will pick up that book and drop it on the floor, and it will open to that page where Emma sips her coffee. So if I could change anything, it would be that.
It's always the little things, right? It's those little
Hmm.
details. Um, and then also kind of pulling from our participant questions, can you talk a little bit about choosing to set it in New Orleans and what drew you to that?
Yes. So it's set in New Orleans because the original magic system was voodoo. And I feel like if you're telling a voodoo story, it has to be set in New Orleans, which, if you have not been, you absolutely must go to New Orleans. It is such a magical city, like in real life. The people are absolutely amazing. It is absolutely beautiful. And I have never had a bad meal in New Orleans. The food is amazing no matter where you go. It's very hard to mess up food in New Orleans. But when you're telling a voodoo story, I was like, it had to be set in New Orleans. And like the city like imprinted on me and the story in such a way that even when I rewrote it with my agent, and part of what I rewrote was reimagining the magic system because that was part of her initial feedback was that she wanted me to come up with my own magic system and not just
Mhm.
use voodoo. And I said, okay, well, now you're onto something. And so generational magic became inspired by voodoo. So that's why there's a lot of similarities between voodoo and hoodoo. and the generational magic that you see in Blood Debts and Blood Justice. But I also expanded it to add the branches of shadow magic and light magic, which you will find out more about as the series continues.
How was it developing your own magical system? What was that
Mhm.
process kind of look like, working from that seed of voodoo and hoodoo?
Yeah, so I did a lot of research on like existing like magical practices just for influence on setting up these fictional magic systems. And one thing that I also wanted to be conscious of when I was building this, and that I also enjoyed when I was doing the world building, is how the magic system is so heavily linked to culture and history. Um, just because like that knowledge just of our past and of our ancestors, like in itself, even in like our natural world today, is so powerful. And it was really cool to be able to weave that into the magic system. Now, I am also, like I said, I'm super analytical. So I actually create a world building document for every fantasy story that I write. But the one for the Blood Debt series, like it's off the hook. Like first of all, I have two separate documents. One has a complete like timeline of all of the major events that happened for like up to like almost like 70 years before the beginning of Blood Debts. I have like all of the backstory for like what happened before the very first word of Blood Debt, so we know how we got there. Um, I even have, and then I have a separate document that's like all of the details about the magic system, about like the gods, how the different branches of magic works, like the Moon King's history, all of that stuff. So I sat and I thought through all of that, and I created that whole document because I had to know. I wanted to know every single detail that I could about the world and how it worked before I started creating this story. And so, yeah, and so I do that with every project. But the ones that I created for Blood Debts are just like out of this world.
I was going to say, is there a prequel somewhere in the plan with all of this kind of history?
Actually, I would not be opposed to writing a prequel. And if I did write a prequel, it would be set during the War of the Moons, and it would follow the story of Caspar Moses, who is someone that you hear about in Blood Justice.
Okay, all right, fingers crossed. Let's see. We have a lot of really fantastic questions. I'm going to try and prioritize
Yay.
those and take a look and see some of the ones we
Okay.
have on um,
These are
blood
good
debts in
questions too.
particular. Um, one of these, do you have a favorite character in Blood Debts?
Yes, I have I have many favorites, but the favorite is Clem. Yeah, I love him. I always will love him. I put him through a lot. You probably can't tell if you read Blood Debts and Blood Justice. But like I love him. He's my absolute favorite, and he's gonna be okay. He's I promise. He's gonna be okay.
And then I guess this is, I think, a really great little bit of a process question. We have some questions about kind of characters' voices and using characters' voices to kind of establish who they are in writing their perspectives. And then also with that, you have some of the characters who are writing in first person and you have some in third person past tense, and kind of how those
Hmm.
stylistic choices inform how you kind of build those characters for us.
Hmm. Okay. So character voice is something that is very important to me, and it's something that like I had to teach myself how to do well, and that was part of my agent's feedback for me in the very beginning, because she actually suggested that I cut Chris. Because her POV was not as strong as Clem's, and I was like, "Wait, wait, wait! Don't make me cut her." I was like, "I was like, there's no story without her." So, I was like, let me fix it. And so I did what I do, and I went and I got some craft books about like developing characters, and I studied. And that is how the worksheet exercise for the character dossiers, that's how that worksheet exercise came about in my novel planning kit. And so I do that now for all of my characters. But that was born from that exercise of me trying to figure out how to develop a well-rounded character and give them a voice that makes them stand out in a story. And I came up with that and I did it for Chris, and not only for her, but I did it for every single character that got a focal POV in Blood Debts and Blood Justice. And it really helped me figure out who they were. And another thing that I do when I'm drafting is I draft in chronological order by POV. So I have I start with a detailed outline. And how I plot these books is ridiculous. Like I have swim lanes with like major plot points, and like I have them connected to show like how decisions made by one person affects another person's timeline. Um, but so once I have the detailed outline, I draft by character. So I will write and I typically start with Valentina because she's my favorite to write. So I start with her and I write all of her chapters from start to finish. And then I start over. And then I do Zach and the interstitials. And then I start over again and I do Chris. And then I save Clem for last because that's my baby and I have to save him for last. And the last part of the question about the stylistic choice, I did that on purpose because there were so many POVs in this story. I wanted it to be very clear that Chris and Clem are the heroine and the hero of this series. Everyone else is either a minor important character or a villain. And part of the side effects of me working so hard to develop characters is now I do it so well that I develop the villains almost as well as I develop the heroes and the heroines. And so um, I I put them in the villain, everyone else who's not Kristen Clem in third person past because I wanted to distance the reader a bit from that character because I wanted them to be really close with Chris and Clem because at its core, this is their story. And it's funny because and it's almost like, why did I do that? Because it doesn't really work because because I write the villain so well in third person past, like it's almost like I could have just left it all the same. And so like my editor, when I was working on Blood Justice, she specifically told me like she and I will meet and go over the outline and I'll tell her the whole story and she'll give me like feedback live before I start drafting. And so when we got to the end of the outline, she was like, okay, Terry. Now she's like, please do not humanize the villains too much. She's like, what you have here is very good, but like also they're villains.
You do need that conflict, but like a well-rounded
Mhm.
villain, you should be
Right?
able to see how they come to the decisions that they make.
Hmm. And I love a good
Um,
villain with points.
well, if you don't have a good villain, it's hard for that conflict to really feel like it has stakes.
Hmm. Yes.
And then we do have a question about what inspired you to set Blood Debt's main storyline in the modern day 21st century,
Hmm.
a version of the world that we're in today.
Hmm. Because a lot of what I was personally experiencing influenced Blood Debts and especially Blood Justice. I was rewriting Blood Debts during the summer of 2020, and we all know what was happening then with the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was also coincidentally facing a grave injustice of my own in my personal life, and I felt very powerless. And it was cathartic for me to write Blood Debts as well as Blood Justice because it allowed me to explore my complex feelings on just like the concept of justice at like a macro level, in the larger world and a micro level, in our individual lives. And I felt like the topics and the themes of what I wanted to discuss with that story felt more relevant in modern times. And actually, to go back to the other question about what would I change, if I
Mhm.
could change anything, I would set the story later. Because right now, Blood Debts takes place in 2019, and I would bump it up a few years and have it take place in like 2022 or 2023.
Even more in this
Hmm.
moment with how things changed at that point.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's really interesting because, Blood Debts does deal with big social themes and it also deals with big personal themes. Your characters have a
Hmm.
lot of big emotions and coming of age. And so there's a lot of this material going through. And I'm wondering whether you want to talk about handling those ideas, especially in something directed towards young adults.
Hmm. Yeah. That's one of the things that I love about writing for young adults because they are incredibly smart. And I especially love how they have just like built-in BS detectors. And I think it's because, like kids are like they're born innocent and then like adults like put all of our stuff onto them and our expectations and all of this other stuff and like they lose that innocence. But what I love about kids is like especially the ones who haven't lost that innocence, like I love how honest they are, right? And I feel like as adults, like we owe it to them to be honest with them, especially when it comes to the media that we're writing and we're creating for them. And part of me being honest to them is being honest about like my experiences. And I write from a very personal place. Like every single, even the villains, I put a little bit of myself into every single character. So, and that's part of what lends itself to making like those characters and those scenes feel so visceral because like I'm tapping into my own emotion. And I kind of see all of my writing as not really a cautionary tale, but just like a collection of everything that like I've learned and I've taken all the wisdom that I've taken from my life, the 40 years that I had been here. And like I get asked a lot, like if I could go back and give some advice to my younger self, what would it be? And quite honestly, I would just take a box of like all of my published works and like give it to him and say, here, like this is everything that I've learned, and I made it fun for you. So this is everything that you need to know over the next couple of years.
That's that's really wonderful in terms of like what literature, not just in reading, but in writing can do in terms of processing and handing things on. Did you ever with this, was Blood Debts ever conceived at any point as being in an adult text? Did you ever get any pressure to kind of look at adult publishing, or has it always
Mhm,
been pretty firmly in young adult as the vision and the publishing?
mhm. Actually, no. When I was talking about it with my agent, we were trying to decide should it be young adult or should it be adult? And she, bless her heart, she made me make a decision, and I love her for it. That's what I love about her. Like she she makes me make a decision. She makes me stand by it. But I decided that based on the themes and based on the story that I needed to tell, it lended itself better to young adult. And honestly, I have been thinking back about that decision. And I'm almost wondering if it might have done better as like an adult contemporary fantasy. And part of the reason being that because of my earlier comment about like how smart kids are, like teens are, And part of me, like, because we know that kids read up, right? So, like a lot of the middle grade age kids are reading young adult, and a lot of the young adult kids are reading adults. Like, I was reading adult in high school. Like, I was reading Sister Soldier and Eric Jerome Dickey and like all this other stuff. Um, so I like a part of me wonders if it were adult, like would I find more of the teen audience as well? Because I know a lot of teens that read Game of Thrones, and that's not something that I think I would want a teen to read. But I don't know.
It's an interesting thing with the marketing distinctions.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, Moving a little bit back toward characters, we do have some questions about how you kind of come to your characters, particularly if someone who's interested in Valentina, who you said is so much fun to write. But did anything or anyone inspire her?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Valentina is inspired by one of the best villains of all time, the queen herself, Cersei Lannister. I love Cersei. And what I love about Cersei was like she had such an interesting backstory. And she was so unapologetic about what she believed in and standing up for herself, like no matter what. Like once she started down a path, you could not tell her, like there was not no such thing as too far. And I was like, I loved that. I hated the ending that she got in the show. She didn't get the ending that she deserved. And so writing Valentina is my way of paying homage to Cersei Lannister.
Giving her another ending.
Hmm.
There's also some questions about, are there specific inspirations for the names in Blood Debt?
Oh, actually, yes. So the name Christine and Christina were inspired by my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. Her name was Christine, and she and I were really close when I was a kid. She also passed away when I was very young. But like some of my earliest and like best memories were spending time with her, and so I wanted to honor her in a way, and so. I definitely added her name twice in that book. Um, and I think that was it. Like none of the other, oh, I'm sorry, Ursula. Sh Her name was inspired by the Sea Witch from The Little Mermaid, which is my favorite Disney movie. And Ursula is another one of my favorite villains too.
Ursula has one of the best musical numbers in all of
Yes,
Disney, in my
yes.
personal opinion. I know those can be that can be controversial, but I should say
Hmm.
it's one of my favorite musical numbers. There we go.
Yes, your taste.
Absolutely. And then we've got some questions a little bit more about your process. In particular, we've got some questions about whether you've had writer's block or creative blocks and kind of what you've done with those challenges if you have.
Mhm. So, I don't typically, so that's a lie. I was getting ready to tell a lie. I have had writer's block before, but I've figured out a way to kind of get around it now. Because I've started paying more attention to like my body and my brain and like what they're trying to tell me. And sometimes, a lot of the times, writer's block or a block in like our creative flow is trying to tell us to take a break for one reason or another. It could be that we're tired. It could be that we're uninspired. It could be like we could be hungry. We could be dehydrated. Like there could be any number of reasons why we can't write. But the solution is not continuing to sit in front of the computer and beat yourself up and make yourself feel bad. So what I do is I like to take a break. And especially too, like I like to pace myself as well because what I'll do is when I'm drafting, I'll get to a point where I feel good about the story. I don't push myself. If I feel like I've done enough and I'm at a place where I feel good, I'll stop. So that way, when I pick it back up the next day or whenever, I'm picking it back up in a good place where I'm excited to get back to work. Um, but that doesn't happen and I have to stop because I'm feeling uninspired or whatever. I take a break. I live. Just take a nap, go to the gym, exercise, ride your bike, watch a movie, play a video game. Video games are very good for like getting your creative juices flowing, especially like an open world game where you can just like explore and talk to NPCs and do stuff and just zone out. Also, talking to other writer friends, I call myself the book whisperer because I love like brainstorming with other writer friends and like talking about like plot and characters and stuff. And like when they get stuck, they know to come to me. And like I will get on the phone with them, just like brainstorm and talk about their story. And taking your focus off of your project to help someone else like is a way to like trick your brain into getting spinning again, and then when you're off the phone and you're done, like then you start thinking about things that you want to do in your project, and it makes it a little bit easier to get back into it.
I think that's a really good point that kind of endless production isn't really feasible
Hmm.
for hardly any of us, that we also need to just do other things, but also kind of like that input, that compost of
Hmm.
playing with other people's problems, your creative
Yeah.
problems, and just intaking creative work. Um,
Hmm.
I
Yes.
think that's really lovely, and that kind of like gentleness in that towards yourself of,
Hmm.
we can take time and come back to
Hmm.
this.
Yes, especially us creators, we're gentle people, so to be gentle with yourself.
Um, we've got a couple questions about favorites. Some are bigger and some are smaller favorites. One
Okay.
is, you've talked a lot about world building and how immersed you get in that. Do you have a favorite part of creating worlds?
Ooh, my favorite part of creating worlds are the backstories and the history because you can get so messy with like the backstory and it's like how you reveal what happened and like who used to date who and like who backstabbed who and like who died and why. And it's so much fun to just like build that in the background and just have it in your back pocket. It's like saving your draw fours in a game of Uno until the end.
I love that. I love that analogy. All your draw fours. Oh, fantastic. We also have a question. I think you kind of answered this earlier, but for the record, who is your favorite villain in pop culture?
Okay. I
Or
said
one of them?
Cersei.
Whenever we do favorites, it's always just one of.
Hmm. It Yeah, it would be Cersei or Ursula. I'm really hard on my villains. Um yeah, I think yeah, they're the best ones, the best examples. I take my villains very seriously.
Fantastic. And then what about one of your favorite scenes to write?
Um Favorite scene to write. There are so many. Um so there were I give you a couple from both books. From Bloodbeds, one of my favorite scenes was the scene towards the beginning when Ursula and Lenora got into their little confrontation, and and then like Ursula, like, well, I won't spoil it, but like things got heated in the parking lot. Um, it was, and if you can't tell, I have a lot of influence from soap operas because I grew up watching The Young and the Restless and The Bold and Beautiful. And this series has been called The Young and the Restless with Magic before. So, so if you cannot tell, the story is also heavily influenced by soap operas. So that was one of my favorite scenes. Next favorite scene is the one towards the end when Clem and Jean Louise go to the abandoned warehouse to get the cadavers. I love that whole chapter because it was such a beautiful like exploration of the relationship between Clem and John Louise and like how it had grown over the course of the book. And then also like the scene in the warehouse with the cadavers. And this was really cool and it was a little creepy. And I like writing stuff like that. And Blood Justice. Um, Definitely the scene towards the beginning. No, I'm sorry. The very first chapter of Blood Justice, Chris's opening. That's one of my favorites. Um, and the very first, is it the very first chapter? No, it's not the very first chapter of Valentine. It's the one where she is trying to summon her grandparent I'm trying not to give spoilers. She tried to summon someone from the nether realm, from the spiritual realm, and she summoned someone else by accident. Love that one. And then the very last scene between Chris and Clem after the climax, I cry every time I read it. And like I love that whole like back half of that book, like all of part four and part five is like some of my favorites.
That is fantastic. That's good when you have so many that you loved writing, right? Like that's loved writing that book. I do also love all of the interpersonal conflict. Now that you've mentioned that, I can see the soap opera. And when you talk about
Hmm.
backstories being full of backstabbing, yeah,
Yes.
we can see all that come together. Um, and then as we're coming towards kind of the end of our visit, can you share a little bit about some of your favorite authors or some of the works that you've loved and that have inspired you?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, first off is Adam Sass, who is the author of Cursed Boys and Broken Hearts, um, 99 Boyfriends of Micah Summers, Your Lonely Nights Are Over, and Surrender Your Sons. Also, Jazz Hammonds is another absolute favorite contemporary. They're a young adult contemporary writer. They wrote We Deserve Monuments, and the most recent book is called Thirsty. It's both amazing. We Deserve Monuments is my absolute favorite of theirs. Also, and the Queen, Jordan Flecko, and Ray Bearer and Redemptor are quite honestly like some of the best examples of high fantasy out there. Like you absolutely must read Ray Bearer. The audiobook is amazing. Jonice Abbott Pratt narrates the Ray Bearer series. And I first heard her listening to that audiobook and I just fell in love with her performance. And when we started working with Macmillan Audio for the Blood Dagger book, they asked me if there were any narrators that I wanted to work with. And I was like, Jonice Abbott Pratt, please. And so she auditioned for Chris and it was just absolutely perfect. And I was like, yes. And she has been so amazing as Chris. So if you get a chance to listen to the audiobook, like all of my audiobooks are phenomenal. So just highly, highly recommend all of them.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's great that you got to have that come together because I know
Mhm.
sometimes you don't have a whole lot of say with the audiobooks and how those
Yeah.
kind of recreate your work in that new format. And then with that, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what is next for you and how you kind of see your writing and your career moving forward from here.
Yeah, so right now I am working on the finale of the Alex Wise versus the End of the World trilogy. It is called Alex Wise versus the Gods of the Apocalypse. That one is a little bit delayed. It's not coming out until 2026, but I promise you it will be worth the wait. I'm relishing working on this one. It's bittersweet because I get to end the series the way that I want, but it's also sad because I don't want to say goodbye to my apocalypse babies. Like I love Clem. He's one of my favorite characters, but like Alex is like a miniature version of me. And it's one of my most special projects. So I'm working on wrapping that up. And I am also working on an adult romantic fantasy that is a high fantasy science fiction mashup inspired by The Last Unicorn. That one it's definitely coming out in 2026, but we have not announced it yet. So be on the lookout for that. And aside from that, I'm working on an adult psychological horror. So that one's not sold yet. So I can't tell you too much about that, except it's my most technical project yet, and I want to play with the reader's concept of reality.
Fantastic. Well, that sounds like you have more than a few stories kind of going at this time.
Yes. Yeah, I try
Um,
to keep the pipeline full.
I was gonna say, is it easy keeping track of that many pieces, or are they all in such different places in the
Mhm.
process that you're kind of interacting with them differently?
I keep them all in different places in the process. Like typically at any given point in time, I have one project that's like in the early concept and development stage where I'm doing like world building, character development, just like jotting down notes. I have another one that I'm drafting, and then I have one that I'm probably revising. And so I usually keep it
Okay,
cycling that way.
fantastic. Well, we are excited to see all of those as those come out. And again, thank you so much for your time. We have many questions in the Q&A that I was not able to work in our time. So thank you all for such incredible engagement, our participants. I tried to work as many as I could into our conversation. And I hope that you all got to hear something that you were very interested in. And again, thank you for joining us tonight. With those giveaways, we'll be in contact following the event, probably next week. And again, thank you so much for joining us, Terry. Really wonderful conversation. Really appreciate your time. And I hope everyone has just an absolutely wonderful evening.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you for those amazing questions too.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.